Hi, this is Julie at Prairie Junction Quilt Shop in Cozad, Nebraska. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of our Saturday sampler programs that we have going on this year. The quilt we're working on is this one right here. It's called Lady Scrap Basket, and it's designed by Bits and Pieces. We started this a little bit earlier in the year, but we do have kits for the entire project. For people that would like to jump in and join us now, you can order a complete kit to make the entire quilt. Today, for our April Saturday sampler session, I'm going to show you our two blocks that we'll be focusing on. The first one is this block here. It's our 4.5-inch pinwheel block, and it will be found on page 14 in your pattern. Now, this is a very simple block that uses half square triangles. So you're going to cut 2 7/8-inch squares of everything for this particular project, and you're going to cut those in half diagonally to make 2 triangles. And then you're going to sew the 2 triangles together to make your half square triangles. Now, because you're sewing on a bias edge, one of my tips for you is I like to chain piece all of those half square triangles together. And then before I press that block open, I like to give it a quick press like this with my iron, and that helps set that seam down into your block so that it's not as likely to stretch when you press it open. And then I'll gently fold that block open, and I will press it with the dark side of the seam allowance towards the darker fabrics and give it a press. And right here I have a wool pressing mat, and if you haven't used those before, they're a really popular item right now. The advantage to using the wool pressing mat is that the wool heats up and allows you to get heat onto your block from each side and helps give you a nice crisp press. So that's the basic way to make your half square triangle. And now you'll want to trim off your little bunny ears off of each piece. And then you will arrange your 4 blocks. This is hard to do backwards. It goes this way. You'll arrange your 4 half square triangles into a square, and you'll sew 2 pieces together, and then you'll sew those 2 sections together as well. Now, when I was pressing those, I liked to press my seam towards the darker piece in each unit. So for this top row, I pressed my seam going this direction, and for my bottom row, I pressed the seam going in that direction. And then when I sew those 2 units together, you'll see my seams are going in opposite directions here. And so when I lay those 2 pieces right sides together to sew them, those seams nest really well together. And that allows you to get a nice flat block. Now, once I sewed those 2 units together, I pressed that seam open in between those block units. And I think when you have so many seams coming together in the middle of your block, that helps you get a flatter block there instead of having all those seams pressed to one direction or another. And then you will join those block units together. And one section will be made up of 2 blue pinwheel blocks, and one section will be made up of 3 red pinwheel blocks. And if you take a quick look at the quilt, there up towards the top row, you'll see the 2 pinwheel blocks go up in that section. So you'll be able to go ahead and join those with some of the blocks that we've made in previous months. And then you'll see the 3 red pinwheels actually go vertically a little bit later in our quilt. So you want to set those aside and save those as we get further on in the quilt. So that's the first set of blocks we're going to make, the 4.5-inch pinwheels from page 14. And then the second block units that we're going to make are our 12.5-inch flower blocks, and they'll be found on page 8 in your pattern. Now, there are a few more pieces in this block, but it's all still very simple piecing. You're going to arrange your block units into rows as you sew them together. And then you're going to do a little bit of applique to finish the block off. So the block units are actually all this little unit right here, and you make multiples of those, and they go in different directions in your quilt. And I see right now I had that piece flipped around. It's so easy to do. That's why these felt boards are so nice, that you can lay your blocks out and can double check those before you start to sew. So the basic block here is really just adding snowball corners to two opposite sides of that block unit. So you're going to have a red square, and you're going to have two smaller cream squares. And those are going to get positioned on opposite sides of your block. Now, there are a couple different ways that you can approach this. A traditional way would be to draw a diagonal line down those cream squares and then sew on that drawn line. And sometimes I actually like to sew just a tiny thread width on the outside of that drawn line. If you tend to have problems when you fold your corners over, if they don't go all the way to the corner, chances are you're sewing a little bit too far in. If you sew just a little smidge to the outside of your drawn line, then your corners will go all the way to the corners of your block. So that's one method where we're going to draw the line and then stitch on the line on both of those cream squares. Now, I like to save as much time as I can, and I like to speed sew when it's possible. So I'll show you one of my tricks for squaring up the blocks if I'm using this method where I've drawn the diagonal line down my blocks. I have a rotating cutting mat here. It's this Olfa 12-inch square rotating mat, and you can see that it actually turns. So I've positioned 4 of my blocks that I've already sewn here on my cutting mat. And then I really find the Creative Grids, the 3.5 by 12.5 inch quick trim ruler, is one of my favorite sizes for trimming up blocks. So I'm laying the 1/4 inch line on my ruler. I'm going to lay right on the line that I sewed on my block, and that'll allow me to trim a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I can quickly trim 1 block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks, 4 blocks, and then I can magically turn my mat around, and now I can trim down the side on the other side of those 4 blocks. And see how quick that was, as opposed to having to handle each of those pieces individually. I was able to trim up 4 at a time, and then I can keep repeating that process till I've made all of my blocks. And then I'm going to press the seam allowances on those so that it goes towards the dark fabric, just because I don't want that darker fabric shadowing through beneath my lighter fabrics. So I'm going to press those towards the dark. And then I want to show you one other way that you can approach that as opposed to drawing the diagonal line and stitching. You can use the Creative Grids folded corner clipper, and that allows you to actually trim your seam allowance before you sew. So I would position my square, my cream square on the corner of my red square, and then I'm going to line up the blunt edge of my folded corner trimmer, and it's actually the left edge of the ruler when I'm looking at it. So I've lined up the left edge and this top blunt point with the edge of my cream square, and then I'm going to trim that seam allowance off. Now this is a 1 7/8 inch square, so don't be thrown off that the bottom of your square doesn't match up with the line on your ruler. The ruler is actually gridded off in 1/4 inch increments, so it's just going to kind of fall in between 2 of those markings. But as long as you've got this left edge and the top edge lined up, it will be fine. And then I'm able to trim that off. And now I already have my perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am able to stitch right from that point all the way across to this point, and I'm still going to end up with a perfect corner square, but I don't have to go back and trim after I've done. And then I would do the same thing on the opposite corner. I would just line up that blunt edge and trim that corner off, and then I would sew that particular side. So it's the same way to accomplish a different goal. It's just a different tool that you can use to accomplish that. So that was the Creative Grids folded corner clipper. And then the other ruler I was using, once again, was the Creative Grids 3.5 inch by 12.5 inch quick trim ruler. So once I have all those block units put together, those were the little snowballs that we just made. We're going to sew them in a row across, and there's a little insert piece, a little filler strip that goes in between there. Then I have 2 pieces and a filler strip, your large square, another 2 pieces and a filler strip, and those go into one row. And then you have another row of those blocks down in the bottom, and then you will sew those 3 rows together. So that's the piecing part. Now this block has a little bit of applique on it, and the pattern calls for fusible applique. You could certainly use whatever method you want. I've used heat and bond as my fusible web, and so you're going to make some stems and some leaves. And a couple tricks that I have for you for the applique. To get the perfect little stems, I actually just cut a rectangle of my heat and bond fabric, and I ironed it to the back of my fabric for my stems. And then that's actually a 1/4 inch stem. So I'm just going to trim off a little straight edge. And then I'm just going to use the 1/4 inch line on my ruler. And I'm going to trim 2 1/4 inch strips off of that fabric. And then I will trim those strips to the appropriate length as called for in the pattern. And then I'll peel off my paper backing, and then I'm going to iron those down onto the background of my block. Now you'll want to make sure that they are centered across the diagonal of your block, and you'll notice they don't come all the way to the corners of your block, and that helps reduce some bulk there because you're going to cover it with another applique piece as well. So don't panic if your stem doesn't come all the way to your block. It's intended to be that way. So I ironed my first stem down, and then I blanket stitched it in place, and then I ironed my next stem down and stitched it in place. That avoids you having to stop and start over the places where it intersects. And then I added my leaves, and I'll stitch those in place. And there's actually leaves on each set of there, but I wanted to make sure you could see that that corner doesn't intersect before I finish those. And then you have a couple ovals that get appliqued on the top as the last step. Now a tip I have for the ovals is that's a fairly light colored fabric going over top of a fairly dark colored area with lots of intersections. So to make sure that all of that doesn't shadow through your light colored fabrics, I actually ironed 2 layers of fabric together. So before I cut out my ovals, I ironed my tan print fabric onto a piece of just like a solid cream or a solid white fabric to create 2 layers of fabric so that I won't get shadowing through. And then I went ahead and fused my oval onto the back of my fabric, and then just treated those 2 layers as one piece to iron those in place. So that's my trick for you to prevent shadowing. You know, that's great if you're doing anything light, like maybe if you're doing a Santa Claus beard on top of a red Santa outfit. You can use that technique anywhere that you don't want your colors to shadow through. One other little tip I wanted to share with you in terms of notions is when I'm cutting things out with fusible web, one of my favorite scissors to use are the Karen K Buckley scissors. And the blades actually have a little bit of a serrated edge on them, and that helps them grip the fabric as you're cutting. So to prepare my leaves, I've traced them onto the paper side of fusible web. I've trimmed out generally around it, not right directly on the line, but leaving a little space. Then I iron it onto the back of my fabric, and now I can actually cut on that line and get a nice crisp cut. And those serrated blades really prevent your fabric from slipping as you cut. So I love to use them for cotton applique and for wool applique as well. I think they give you just a nice crisp cut. So those are my favorite scissors. They come in a couple different sizes, and they both have the serrated blades on them as well. So that's my basic tips for you for appliquing this particular block. And once again, that was your 12.5-inch flower block on page 8. So hopefully we've set you up for success with this month's block. And once again, this was the Ladies Scrap Basket Quilt. For those of you that are new joining us, we do have kits available for that. The kit is for the complete quilt, and I'll just show you a sample of how the blocks come packaged. Each month's block comes with just the specific fabrics you need to make that block, and then it has a color photo of our blocks as well to help you with the fabric placement. So we try to make it easy for you to figure out what goes where, and we would love to have you join us. We do a Saturday sampler program on the second Saturday of each month, but you are certainly welcome to work at your own pace as well. We do have complete kits available, and we would love to help you with that. So once again, this was Julie at Prairie Point Junction, and you can find the products that I mentioned on our website at prairiepointjunction.com. Thank you.